Hello, and welcome back to another episode of C-Suite Unplugged. I'm your host, Adam Legg, and in this series, I talk to Alberta's top CEOs, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about their journey to the C-suite, what keeps them up at night, their perspective as a leader in their industry, and their outlook on the future. If you find this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show. Warren, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Excellent. Well, Warren, really happy to have you on the podcast to learn more about GrainsConnect and agriculture. But one of the really neat parts of this podcast is that we get to learn a little bit more about our CEOs as people and their journeys. And so, first off, perhaps help our listeners who aren't in the grain business understand a bit more about GrainsConnect, what you do, who you serve, and the business itself.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, we're essentially a pipeline. We buy grain from farmers, and we've got 4 upcountry big concrete grain terminals that we constructed over the past 8 years. 2 in Saskatchewan, 2 here in Alberta. The Alberta locations are Huxley in and around Trochu, and then 1 in Vegreville, Alberta. Essentially, we're buying grain from farmers, moving it through our facilities, loading it in large unit trains, and that grain goes out to Vancouver, essentially to get loaded in vessels and go around the world. We're basically feeding the world with Western Canadian grains and oilseeds. So we've built this supply chain over the last 8 years, and I'd argue it's probably one of the most efficient supply chains for grain or any other commodity in Western Canada.
Pretty significant operation, moving so much of those critical grain products to market from our hardworking Canadian farmers. I love the way you put it. It's a pipeline, a little bit of a different kind of pipeline than many may think of. Warren, we'll touch a little bit more on GrainsConnect and your operations and et cetera. But let's talk about you. People love to hear the journey of a CEO. So tell us a bit about your journey. You grew up in Manitoba, very early exposure to the grains business through your dad. And tell us a bit about that. And then your journey through the end of high school. Young Warren had the world in front of him. And where did he go from there to the role that you play today?
Well, it's probably a bit unorthodox relative to some of the other CEOs you have on the podcast, but so I grew up on a family farm southwest of Winnipeg, about an hour in an area around Carmen, Manitoba, little village called Graysville, actually, maybe 60 people. My dad and his 2 brothers had about a 2,500 acre farm, and then in the mid 70s built a grain business. I like to think that building a high throughput grain facility on a rail line was new technology when I did it 8 years ago, but my dad preceded me by about 45 years. So growing up in the grain business, is interesting, especially a family business. It's like growing up in the boardroom a little bit. You intuitively hear things day to day that others potentially don't have the luxury of seeing. I was probably 12 or 13 years old and understood the mechanics of hedging grain on a futures market because it was the talk of Sunday dinner. What grain was used for, and wheat for bread and canola for cooking oil and barley for beer and cattle feed, like all that was sort of intuitive. It wasn't something that you needed to go to school for. It was really, really interesting. And my dad was a very savvy businessman and had an interesting ability. I won't say he could see the future, but he could read a situation and predict an outcome in pretty short order. I think it led a lot to his success. He could see where the market would be, where there were opportunities. And that was really sort of intuitive in our family and in their business. So that led to his success. He retired at my age. So they were very successful. And so that was great ground for me to learn. From there, I graduated high school. I didn't go to university, actually. Well, I went to university for a couple months and that didn't quite work out.
Not for me.
Yeah. My sister lived in Calgary, and so I decided I'd pack up my car and come to Alberta and hit the ground trying to get a job in Alberta in the mid 80s, which wasn't always easy. But I did find that my second day here, I got offered a job with Jack Fraser Menswear in Chinook Center Mall. And so one of my favorite stories is I got offered the job. And so I go down the mall to the payphone and phone my dad how excited I was to get this job offer. I'm going to be selling menswear at Jack Fraser, and I just need like about $350 to buy my first suit, shirt, and a tie And then, I'm set. My dad said, well, son, you're on your own now. You're a salesman. You just go back into the store there and you explain your situation, and I'm sure they'll lend you a suit, shirt, and a tie. And this is the time when my dad had $350 to lend me. But sure enough, after a few curse words, I marched back down into the store and explained that I'd love to come to work for them, but I needed them to lend me my first suit, shirt, and a tie so I could start tomorrow. And sure enough, they did. And that's how I got going in the menswear business and in retail. And so I did a number of retail jobs. I managed the Jack Fraser Menswear in Red Deer and worked for RDTV in sales, sold RVs. So I did a number of things. And then one February in the RV lot, it was minus 30 something. And I phoned my dad and I said, okay, time to get back into the grain business and start to build a career,
Mm-hmm.
probably sometime in my mid 20s. And that's when I got back to Winnipeg and went to work for a company called Patterson Grain as a trader. Since then, I've always mostly been on the commercial side. I was a trader pretty much all my young career, spent 4 or 5 years with Patterson, and then went down to the US, which was incredibly good experience for me. Worked for a company called Lansing Grain. That was more like a boiler room situation where you got given a geography and a commodity, and you traded that commodity in your geography, and it was smile and dial, and it was a computer and a phone, and you ate what you killed. And it was really a great learning ground for understanding markets, understanding where opportunity was, understanding the flow of grain globally. So spent some of my career down in the US at a point in time where understand that the Canadian market was still regulated. Canadian Wheat Board still was marketing all the wheat and barley out of Canada. So there wasn't as much opportunity for sort of a cross-country trading business or trading business in Canada as there was in the US. So it was a really great opportunity for me. That was early 2000s. And after 9/11, the immigration rules in the US got a lot more difficult to navigate. So we ended up coming back to Canada in about 2003. I went to work in the transportation business for a company out of Winnipeg called Clayson Transport. They're a Mullen company, great family. Really started to understand the movement of all products and commodities. They had a fairly good transload business that was handling fertilizer, grain, road salt, consumer products. They just had their hands in a lot of pies, and it was just great experience to understand the movement of all sorts of different products and commodities on rail and in truck. So I spent the next number of years in the transportation business. So at the end of 2012, I've had 25 years of trading grain and transportation experience, and the wheat board deregulates. Here's an opportunity for global commodities companies that have been on the outside looking into Canada to now make an entry into a marketplace that they've never been able to enter before. The experience that I had doing all that the last 20 plus years put me in a great position to take on a deregulated marketplace. I got a job with an Australian company called Grain Corp, who is still 50% shareholder of GrainsConnect, and started their North America trading office here in Calgary and got me to 2015. So
That's fantastic, Warren, and lots of background in sales, everything from grain to RVs to men's business wear. You must be a master of sociology and human psychology and what motivates people and the art of persuasion. So I'll make sure I bring you along to my next negotiation, that's for sure. Growing up on the farm and being integrally involved in your dad's operation, what would you say are sort of three things about our farming communities and about our farming culture in Canada that you really sort of hope others will know and that you bring to bear in your leadership and role today?
the farmers in Western Canada, I'll say for the most part, are really just stewards of the land. That's how they view themselves. They're caretakers. They're incredibly open and honest and hardworking and do so many good things for our country, so many good things for the communities. That was how we were raised in it. Open, honest, straightforward way, treat people well and they'll treat you well. And recently, you've got farmers and ranchers a bit under attack on the environmental piece. I just don't know anyone in that space who isn't committed to doing the right thing for the land and the communities around them. So, yeah, it was a great place to grow up.
Warren, you've been at the helm of a company that, despite being relatively young, has been named one of Canada's best managed companies for 4 years in a row now. Congratulations on that distinction. What's your leadership philosophy? How do you approach leadership for GrainsConnect?
I guess, surround yourself with really good people and it makes your job a heck of a lot easier. I've been really fortunate. We've been very intentional about hiring for talent and training the technical pieces, but I work with some just incredibly talented people, and you just have to get used to not being the smartest guy in the room, because having the really good, talented people around you makes your job just that much easier. I would say that's been it. And doing what we did, getting a greenfield grain business off the ground, just took a massive heavy lift from so many people. And yeah, couldn't do it without, a good team around you.
It is all about the people, isn't it? Surround yourself with the best and let them do their finest work, right? That's what we're all tasked with. Let's switch a little bit to kind of more broadly agriculture, and then we'll talk about bringing the Grains Connect story into that. But I think our audience would be fascinated to learn the journey of grain from our fields here in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba to the ports of Vancouver, and their journey off to other countries. From my understanding, it takes about 3 days. But maybe could you tell us the journey of a little grain of wheat or pearl of barley from its being harvested in Vegreville, Alberta, to your Fraser Grain Terminal and then off to international markets? What does that journey look like and how long does it take?
So the interesting thing about grain marketing is that we grow one crop that gets planted in May and harvested in September for the most part, but it takes the entire year to move the crop. So the farmer in Vegreville will put the majority of his grain in a grain bin and mark it at different points in time during the year. That grain will buy for future delivery. Let's say buy for January delivery. He'll bring that grain to the elevator in January. We'll probably clean it and condition it so that it's ready for shipment. That probably will take the better part of a week. And then that grain goes into a rail car. So we have these big loop tracks attached to the CN main line at each one of our facilities that holds 130 plus rail cars. And we'll load that in about 10 hours. CN brings that train to us. Their crew goes off, gets their allotted amount of rest required for them to continue to operate. Our employees can operate the CN locomotive on our track only, and we load that train in 10 hours. We hand the keys back to CN and they take that locomotive out to the West Coast. And yep, you're exactly right. It takes about 3 days from our facilities in Alberta to get to Vancouver for that grain to be unloaded. And we've got an export terminal on the Fraser River called Fraser Grain Terminal. So that grain gets unloaded into the storage bins at Fraser Grain Terminal and loaded in a vessel probably within 2 days of it actually landing. And then it sets sail for, let's take wheat, for example. Southeast Asia is a huge consumer of Western Canadian wheat. So the likes of Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Philippines, big consumers of Canadian wheat. And so the vessel will head off to some of those destinations for flour for bread or mostly Asian noodles. It's a very quick trip, especially from farm gate to the port. Like within probably 10 days, that grain is through our facilities, cleaned, loaded, unloaded in Vancouver, and loaded in a vessel. So incredibly efficient. Part of what makes our network a bit unique is we have our own rail cars that we lease. So those trains are just dedicated to our facilities. So they're going from Vegreville to Vancouver, back to Vegreville in 7 to 10 days, depending on what's going on out in Vancouver. So,
Yeah, I think that's a lot faster than most people would probably think. We all see the grain silos or the inland terminals around the province and think it's grain sitting there for weeks, if not months. But that's a pretty quick journey off to international markets.
yeah, those
That's
terminals
impressive.
are built for velocity, not storage.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty quick velocity. That's a great
Yeah.
turnover. Let's talk a little bit more about your Fraser Grain Terminal. It opened in 2022. project years in the making. Tell us a bit more about it in terms of how it operates and how it was to get it built.
Well, I guess I'll start with why we're there. When we were looking for a port outlet, we felt that the rail connectivity was extremely important. And so we ended up building on the Fraser River, which has a much more efficient rail corridor than the likes of all the other congestion in the lower mainland around Burrard Inlet. That's where a lot of the other grain terminals are located.
Hmm.
So for us, it was really about rail velocity and making sure that we set ourselves up for being super efficient, especially when things get disrupted. We've seen just in the last couple years, we've had labor disruption on both the railway and the port side of things. We have weather disruption often in Canada. The Rocky Mountains don't make things easier, so we have inherent things that can disrupt our supply chain. It's pretty fragile, I'll say. Then we have things that we can kind of shoot ourselves in the foot at times on the labor front and create some havoc ourselves that can cause us disruption. But I think it was really important for us to have a rail network that was best in class. And we gave up a bit of capacity on the river. The river has draft restrictions, so we can't load a Panamax to say maximum capacity. We end up having to load a little bit at times on the bigger vessels in the deeper water port. But for us, it was really important to be on the most efficient rail network. And so, we're on the Fraser River. Again, we don't have a ton of storage. It's really built for high velocity and throughput. It is state of the art. We're really happy with how it's performing, and it's not easy, as you know, to get things built in Western Canada or in Canada in general.
Generally,
And
I think, yeah.
and so at the point in time you start talking about having tidewater access, it complicates things immensely. And so you're dealing with the port, you're dealing with the environment, you're dealing with fisheries and indigenous. There's 14 indigenous bands that fish on the Fraser River that needed to be consulted. So even though something like grain is very benign, like if we drop some grain in the river, we feed some fish, but it was really a complex project to get approval on and get
Hmm.
built. We did too have some engineering challenges, and so we did have a delay of about a year in getting it constructed. So that coupled on everything else, but it's nice to have it done and operating. And I guess we're probably 3 years now operating, and we got it up and running just in time to have one of the worst droughts in Western Canadian history. So
Ease it into full utilization, I guess, right?
yeah,
Maybe that was Mother
exactly.
Nature's plan for you. How is it doing now? What's its sort of competitive position compared to some of the other facilities on the West Coast?
Yeah, it really is an outlet for us. We have a partner, Parish and Heimbecker. So between Parish and Heimbecker and GrainsConnect, it is utilized just for our grain going through there. It is what we thought it was going to be, which is really, really nice when you build something. It is handling the velocity of grain that we thought it would. The rail corridor is proving, one of the best supply chains for grain in Western Canada. And really happy when you turn the power on these things and they actually do what you hope they were going to do. It's a big relief. One of the things that we are working on, we're actually trialing it today, is one of the ways that we're trying to unlock a bit more capacity at that terminal is with an inclement weather spout. So loading in the rain has always been a challenge in Vancouver. Turns out it
Hmm.
rains in Vancouver. One way to unlock some more capacity at that terminal is to figure out a way to load in the rain. And we have the luxury of having a new facility. And so we're able to bolt on some new technology to our spout attachment that allows us to not have any manpower on the hatch cover, and it's shrouded and sealed so that no rain can get in the hold of the vessel. We're trialing that today with some state of the art dust monitoring, and hopefully we can find a way to unlock some more capacity by being able to load in the rain. And so we've got a trial going on. This is our second attempt at this. And so fingers crossed we can unlock a bit more capacity there.
Yeah, it's a great segue. I'd like to maybe touch on some of the just the trade infrastructure challenges that we have. Canada, we're talking in later October here. We had the rail strikes in August, which put the entire country's supply chain, not just grains, but everything at risk. You speak to some of the challenges of some of the bizarre rules around loading grains in the rain, just due to some of the unwillingness of some of the labor groups to create the infrastructure that would enable covered and dry loading. What's your thought? How do we create some better stability for our trade infrastructure on a go forward basis? And, what are maybe some potential creative solutions around making sure? I mean, grain is a tremendously important product for us to export. We can't be always held hostage by Mother Nature when it decides to rain in Vancouver, which is a notoriously rainy place. So we're not clearly as efficient as we should be in loading grain and getting that churn and that turnover to get our products to market, which ultimately harms our farmers. Anything that you've been thinking about that might create some better stability and certainty so that our international customers can say, I feel comfortable buying Canadian product because I know it's reliable. I know it's going to get here. I know it's going to be on time.
It is a really big challenge, Adam. And when we have protests and labor disruptions, like I said, there's inherent challenges to our supply chain around Mother Nature and the mountains that we just can't avoid.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
there's other things that you wish would run much smoother. One of the things that gets missed, you and I were at a conference last week around productivity, and there was
Mhm.
some commentary around the labor disruptions that actually they didn't last that long, and they were effectively a couple days long, and everybody was back to work. The
Mhm.
problem is that for companies like ours, we were talking 2 months ahead of the rail strike about how much risk we really wanted to put on in selling more grain in a period that we knew there was potential disruption.
Mhm.
And we probably would have sold a half to a quarter of the grain that we potentially would have had we not been concerned about 2 or 3 week rail strike. So yeah, fast forward, the rail strike was only 2 days. Well, you don't recover that grain that we decided not to sell, and we weren't the only ones. You'd never get that opportunity, doesn't come back to you.
Mhm.
And the strike only lasted 2 days, but the impact is far, far greater than that. And I think that gets lost a little bit in some of this. There's a lot smarter people than me trying to figure this out. And I'm not sure exactly how we crack that code, but having partners that are global traders and global consumers of grain, Canada struggles to be a reliable supplier. We work so hard at being a supplier of choice for high quality grains because our Western Canadian farmers produce some of the best quality grain and oil seeds out there. We fall down when it comes to reliability. And
Yeah.
I think it really has an effect on some of the opportunities that we potentially could unlock. But
Well, there are sadly two strikes against Canada. The first is we're a challenging country to get stuff built, big projects getting built. And then secondly, once we do have things built, we have instability in our trade infrastructure, and whether that's rail or seaport. So, can anyone blame customers and investors for looking to more certain jurisdictions? I
uh,
certainly can't. And so we need,
yeah.
that's clearly something that needs to be fixed in this country, is not only how do we get things built faster with more certainty, but also how do we create more certainty in that trade infrastructure? I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, being one of the guys who stands in front of the board and asks for capital, the first two questions are how much and how long
Hmm.
to get a project built. And if you can't answer either one of them or both, the capital probably goes elsewhere. So,
Yeah. Then that was a big theme of our Future Unbuilt project, is that CEOs need to give their boards some certainty and some confidence in the ask for a capital project. And in this country, it's hard. It's really
yeah,
hard.
and I think
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, Adam. I think, it really isn't necessarily about the time it takes. It's about the certainty of the time.
Hmm.
And I know even when we were building the Fraser Grain Terminal, The port was our regulator, and they were trying to get a project built themselves where they were the proponent and the regulator. So when it was dealing with the environment, dealing with the indigenous, they were the ones that were championing our cause, but they had to tread lightly because they had a cause of their own that they were trying to get support for as well. But the point is that at certain jumping off points, the port could hit the pause, I'll call it the chess clock, and they could essentially suspend time. You would be given sort of an idea of how long it would take to get the approval or the necessary responses from certain groups. And at any point in time, they could kind of hit the chess clock and just suspend time. And I know we lost probably 4 to 5 months just in that sort of limbo. And I don't think it's necessarily the time it takes, it's just the uncertainty of the time.
Or your company seems to focus on ease and efficiency for farmers and transportation partners at the top of your priority list. And some neat details. You have say to your drivers that they only need to leave their trucks to open the gate when unloading at your terminals. As we talked about, the rail loading capabilities allow you to load tire locomotives in under 14 hours. You've got an app for clients to monitor their grain progress. Why this focus on efficiency? Why is that so important for GrainsConnect, and is that a competitive advantage for you?
I think for us, really ground ourselves in trying to bring value to family farms in Western Canada. A lot of the people that work at our elevators, they grew up on the farm. They understand what it's like to live on the farm, deliver grain to an elevator. And so we worked really hard to concentrate on the areas of the business where we integrate with the farmer and try and make those experiences as good as possible for the grower. So whether that is our grain merchants driving to the farm gate and picking up samples to determine the quality of grain that they've got so they can now have a commercial discussion about, the marketing plan for the year, whether that's contracting grain on an app that allows them to DocuSign from their phone and not have to pick up the phone, not have to come up the driveway to sign a contract. When they come to the elevator, that they have a load time, they have a load number, we have a kiosk, they just enter their number in the kiosk. Takes them about probably less than 10 minutes, all said and done. By the time they punch in their load number, we take a probe sample of the grain, make sure it's a quality that we're expecting, and then they pull onto the driveway and or the pit and dump the load. And we have another kiosk where they pick up their paperwork. It's all really built for ease of doing business and creating an experience for the grower that is easy. And during the pandemic, having that no personal contact, actually, it was more by fluke than by design. But we were able just to continue business as usual almost because we allowed farmers just to deliver their grain and have very limited person to person contact. I mean, they can park their truck and come in for a coffee if they want, but most farmers are
too busy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They're just driving truck from field from the sitting alongside the combine and loading
Well,
up and then hitting, right?
it's big business now, Adam. It's employees driving trucks, and they don't want their employees just hanging around. And like, they need to get back to the farm, get reloaded, bring the next load to the elevator. Lot of these farms, and they all are still mostly family farms in Western Canada, are big enterprises, and they have access to technology and market information and as much as I do. I mean, these guys are savvy business guys, and they don't want to be they have their assets or people hanging around not working.
Yeah, you can do that in the winter when harvest
Yeah,
is done, right? Yeah.
everybody can go to Arizona.
Exactly. How's 2024 shaping up from a Prairie Grains perspective? Looking at a good, bad, middling year? What are you seeing in
Yeah,
in the terminals?
it ended up being a bit disappointing, honestly. We had such great moisture profile through the spring. We had lots of cool temperatures, moisture up until July 1st, and we were all extremely optimistic that this was going to be an incredibly good year. And unfortunately, Mother Nature turned the tap off and turned the temperature up. Through that July and August period, we had high temperatures, very little rain, and that is a critical growing period for grain in Western Canada. Unfortunately, that affected the yields pretty significantly. We're nowhere near where we were in 2021 when we had the massive drought, but it'll be below average, what I would call below average yields across
Mm,
most of the prairies in Western Canada. Got some test weight issues in some of the barley and potential quality issues in some other commodities, but yeah, bit disappointing. And
yeah.
unfortunately, we were hoping for a big one.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of optimism in June with we had some good moisture and then it just got too hot, and from what I heard, particularly the evenings just stayed too warm to let that crop get through the heat of the day, right?
Yeah.
It just stayed too hot. Yeah, that's really unfortunate for our hardworking farmers. Warren, we'll kind of end on some looks to the future. What's next for GrainsConnect Canada here? What are you guys looking at and considering in the
Oh,
next
it's a
coming
good
years?
question. We're a bit of a one trick pony right now. We've got the 4 elevators and an export terminal. And in years where we don't get the large grain crop, we're a bit susceptible to a smaller crop. And so we need to find a way to fix our scope and scale. So I would say we're looking at ways to diversify our business, not to get into any detail, but we need to fix that part of our business. And so we're looking at ways to do that. What we had to do was get the supply chain up and running and
Mm-hmm.
prove the model, which we've done now. And so now it's time to think about what's next.
Yeah. Well, speaking of what's next, what do you think is the outlook for Alberta? You guys are strongly supportive of Alberta's agriculture sector, both in the communities with the farmers, but then also exporting our commodities. What's your outlook for Alberta and the ag sector here? And are you bullish, concerned? Where do you see us in the next 5, 10 years?
Well, I think Western Canada and Alberta is really well positioned. I mean, we're going to continue to need to feed the world. And there's decisions also being made about putting our food supply into the back end of a car with renewable diesel and
Mm-hmm.
different things. So I'm really optimistic about the future ahead for Alberta agriculture. The concern that I would have is that we kind of get in the way of that a bit. I would like to see food security and food supply be at the same level as climate and other things
Mm-hmm.
on the government's radar. Would be nice to have the agriculture minister sitting at the same table with the energy minister and the environment minister.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's just huge opportunity as the world continues to need the food that we grow. And I just would love to make sure that we protect the farmers and ranchers out there who are doing all the right things to grow that food.
Yeah, that's well said, Warren. Probably the reason why in our define the decade 10-year vision for Alberta that feeding everyone, the agriculture and agri-food opportunity is the number one top one that we identified, followed very closely by the energy opportunity. And couldn't agree more that we need to level up the status of our agriculture minister and the investments in the agriculture portfolio, greater support for the sector, greater enthusiasm and interest and innovation for all of that, because I think we can count on one hand the number of countries that can export more than they need domestically, and Canada is one of them. And so how do we really grow that opportunity and to your point, support the hardworking farmers and ranchers in this country that are up before the crack of dawn every single day, making sure that we're fed and nourished. So I
Yeah.
totally agree with you. Warren, anything else that you wanted to touch on that we didn't cover in the questions or anything last comments or thoughts you want to leave with our listeners?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground, Adam. Appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about our business, talk about agriculture in Alberta to the point that we just made. Doesn't always get, front row status. And
Mhm.
so really appreciate being able to share my thoughts. And yeah, it was a pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, thanks, Warren. Likewise, thank you for your support and for everything you're doing on behalf of the farmers and the Canadian economy. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of C-Suite Unplugged, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB, that's B-I-Z, Council AB, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you like this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.